everyone, my name is Ashton Gleckman and welcome back to Behind the Score, Season 3, Episode 2 for Hans Zimmer and Lisa Gerard's Gladiator. Now this is a film where if somebody were to ask me, what's your favorite film of all time, I would, without a doubt, without question, say Ridley Scott's Gladiator. And that is simply just because the film as a whole, I mean, every level of the movie is so carefully curated and it's made with so much passion. You can just tell it by watching it. The thing that I love so much about this score in specific is just the simple scale of the different places that Hans and Lisa takes the audience through in the film. You have the moments where Lisa will take over and she just transports you to this whole other world. It becomes this immersive, visceral atmosphere, and I think that it accompanies the story perfectly and it becomes one of the true hearts of the film. And then throughout the film you have the battle sequences, which are accompanied by the Gladiator waltz that Hans wrote for the film, and then you have the Rome sequences, which are super Germanic and very sophisticatedly written, and then you have the Morocco sequences, which are very ethnic. So I mean, it goes in so many different directions, but it's all so perfectly balanced within the story and the landscape that Ridley Scott creates. And that's what I think makes the score so brilliant. So in today's episode, I've arranged a suite of music from the film. We have the opening, the battle sequence, The Emperor is Dead, The Might of Rome, Am I Not Merciful, Honor Him, and we're going to be looking at how all of these pieces were built from the bottom up, the orchestration, the harmony, everything like that. We're going to be looking at the themes, the team behind the film, the elements of the score, and do feel free, by the way, in the pinned comment below, you guys can download the project file that I have here, so you can import it into Cubase, or you guys can download the MIDI file and import it into Logic or any other digital audio workstation. And I've also provided the stems, so if you just want to listen to all the individual elements, you guys can do that as well and follow along. But without further ado, welcome, and here is the suite. Gladiator is the story of a Roman general named Maximus, played by Russell Crowe, who is betrayed by Commodus, the ambitious son of Emperor Marcus Aurelius. In hopes of taking the throne, Commodus kills his father and orders the death of Maximus and his family. After escaping and discovering his family has been murdered by Commodus's forces, Maximus rises through the ranks to the gladiatorial arena to avenge the murders of his family and the fallen emperor, Marcus Aurelius. At the 73rd Academy Awards, the soundtrack was nominated for Best Original Score, and the film took home 5 Oscars, including Best Picture. The score also won Best Original Score for a Motion Picture at the 58th Golden Globe Awards. In addition to the film as a whole, the score also had a large cultural impact. From Lisa Gerrard's iconic vocals to the overall musical versatility, it still stands as a musical landmark in the history of cinema. So let's begin to talk about some of the elements of the score. So one of the most interesting aspects, I think, of any project in terms of the music is how the composer actually gets involved with the movie. And with Interstellar, it was all about that one page that Chris wrote, which Hans actually, wrote a piece of music to this one page, and that became the motif of family throughout the movie. And with this movie, Hans went out to the set where they were shooting the big battle sequence at the beginning of the movie, and he saw that sort of visual of, Russell Crowe, the character of Maximus reaching down into the earth before he fought in a battle, and that became a motif for the whole movie, both musically and visually. And since he was a farmer, it was sort of showing his origins. So that's sort of the moment that inspired the first few notes of Gladiator. Now the next thing is Lisa Gerrard. So Lisa Gerrard really is one of the primal hearts of the whole entire movie, and that came about, I believe, they were in Pietro Scaglia's cutting room, and Pietro Scaglia is this very, very sort of legendary director who's done most of Ridley Scott's movies. And, Pietro Scaglia had 3 CDs, and one of them was, I believe, Dead Can Dance from Lisa Gerrard. And he said, what about Lisa Gerrard? And Hans was like, it could be a pretty good idea. So they called Lisa Gerrard. She came out for what was supposed to be a couple weeks, and she ended up staying 4 months or something. And she became, just a super, super important element in the score. And she brought this whole other dimension of emotion. So here's Hans talking just a little bit about how Lisa got involved with the project.
Ridley knows that I'm useless in the mornings and I'm vulnerable because I keep musicians' hours. It's like I have a 9-to-5 job. I start at 9 in the evening and finish at 5 in the morning. So when Ridley phoned me at 9 o'clock in the morning and said, "Hey, do you want to do a Gladiator movie?" all I could think about was men in skirts and sandals. And he went, "No, Hans, it's not that sort of a Gladiator movie." It used to be in the screenplay, it titles Gladiator pretty much straight into the battle. And I realized one of the things that was missing, and it was missing for Ridley as well, was a female soul. There was, we talked about this idea that we needed a female voice in this. And these are the great things that happen during movies.
Now, one thing that's very unique about Gladiator, and also very, very interesting, is the collaborative process between the cutting room and the music department. Hans' studio was actually in the exact same building as where Pietro Scaglia was cutting the movie. So Pietro would go into Hans' studio, Hans would go into Pietro's cutting room, and he would see the dailies, and it's this very collaborative process. So here's just a little bit about that.
Gladiator cutting rooms were over there. I was writing music over here, not too far to go, and at the same time, we could close the door on each other. No, it's very collaborative. The whole idea on this film was that we would work together, for instance, in the same building. his cutting rooms are here at the studio, which makes a big difference because we can go and confer or interfere with each other's ideas, whichever way you look at it, which is truly a great way of working.
So in the final film, there's actually 19 themes and motifs, everything from the battle themes to the earth theme, to the wheat theme, to the Commodus theme. There's a whole lot of them throughout the film, and they sort of reappear at certain moments to really complement the story. So the waltz throughout history is something that's commonly associated with cleanliness. It's dancing, it's organized, it's, Hans took that and he put it on its head, added a little spice of chaos, threw some really, really angry brass on it, and that became the battle aesthetic for the movie. And it's used during the opening battle, the barbarian horde sequence. It's used during all the Morocco gladiator battles, which I think there's 2 main ones. But the battle aesthetic in this movie is so intense and so in your face and perfect for the film. And it's very primal too. When you're in the arena and the brass is coming at you, and it's very stabby, and all the rhythms that sort of come about. It's definitely perfect for the whole Gladiator aesthetic.
One of the things Ridley always lets me do, he lets me be crazy. So I had this idea that all the action sequences should be waltzes. You know, like a Viennese waltz. You can't think of anything more fluffy and civilized and such a beautiful form. Everything is just so and perfect. And I thought, what if I take the shape, the form of a waltz and just make them bloody, savage and brutal.
So one genius transition in this movie is cutting from Morocco to Rome. I think it's just awesome because it's going from something that is so dirty and aggressive and sort of bombastic, cutting to the big sort of beast. And the way that Hans approached it scoring-wise is in this very dramatic, sophisticated sort of aesthetic. And that sort of became the whole concept of Rome in the project. So when we go to Morocco, it's a totally different musical landscape from anything we've seen so far. Vivian Gasparian, who is the musician on the duduk, that sort of takes over the sonic palette, and it becomes this very interesting ethnic, tribal aesthetic. And here's just a little bit about that.
And I just sort of doggedly kept writing for this guy. And one day I got a phone call from a friend of mine, Michael Brook, who said, oh, Jivan's going to be in Los Angeles. And it was just sort of, I just kept writing because I knew, like if you build it, he will come. I just kept doing this. And it was great because he doesn't speak a word of English. He is, he's a god in his own country. He has his own vodka named after him. And if you drink enough of this vodka, the ice will melt and his face is on the inside of the label. You'll actually get to see his face.
So since Maximus is from Spain, they ended up using a guitar as sort of that color, and it was performed by Heitor Piera, and I'll put in a little clip of an interview that he did recently talking about his work on Gladiator, but they ended up using multiple guitarists because what Hans wrote in the final film wasn't really playable, but here's him talking about that really quickly.
I have a story about this. Hans had said, hey man, I want to write a score that it's a guitar concerto. So he brought the guitar, he brought the music, and I said, man, even if I had like 20 freaking fingers, I wouldn't be able to play because, there are more notes than one guitar can handle.
Yeah.
But then I said, what if we go with this idea and we do a guitar orchestra instead of a guitar concerto, right? Like one guitar and the orchestra. Man, and we got carried away. So nowadays...
How many?
Oh man, I think I put like 10 guitars. But nowadays, when he performs this stuff live, he needs 4 guys to play.
Last thing is, similarly to Inception, Interstellar, some music was actually written away from the picture. And the battle scene, for example, some portions of that were written away from the film, and then it was sent to the editor, Petroscalia, and he would sort of edit to it. And it creates this very, very cool environment where the picture is very sort of connected with the music. And they become like this sort of married duo. And I think that effect is really, really cool. But there's just a little bit about the elements of the score. So before we move on to the theme gallery, here's our main team. We have Lisa Gerard as the co-composer / vocals, Nick Lenny Smith on additional music. Nick has composed for films like We Were Soldiers, as well as co-composing The Rock, and he's also conducted many, many sessions, including Pirates of the Caribbean. Gavin Greenaway is a true film music veteran. He has worked on so many projects and most of Hans's projects, and he's also doing a lot of the work on the World of Hans Zimmer tour. And so he's a true genius, and he conducted all of the sessions on this specific film. Klaus Badelt on this project did a bit of additional music, and for the main orchestrators, we have Bruce Fowler, who is Hans's go-to guy. He used to be a trombone player. He worked with Frank Zappa, and he's a genius as well. He's worked on practically every one of Hans's scores for the past couple decades. Then we have Walt Fowler and Richard Harvey, as well as Heitor Piera on the guitar, and Vivian Gasparian on the duduk. So let's take a look at the main thematic material for the movie. A lot of it's introduced in the first 15 minutes of the film during the battle scene, and you also have the wheat theme and the love theme, which are introduced also in the first 15 minutes. But they're greatly expanded upon and developed throughout the whole entire movie. So let's just run through the themes. This one's called the danger motif. And then we have the power motif. then the action motif. And that's a really, really great one because it's swaying back and forth. It's like this uneasy, never-ending spiral of madness. And then we have the chord planing motif, and the reason I call it that is it's literally just the same chord inversion going around, and it creates this very sort of chaotic, uneasy vibe. And you can see it just has, it's not as spiky and aggressive as the other themes, like the danger and the power motif, but it is definitely this like stirring sense of chaos in it. Then we have the two main hero themes. The first one you'll probably notice as being the opening of the battle cue. And then the next one is a much more sort of bombastic hero theme, and it's used probably 3/4 of the way through the battle. And so there's that theme, and I think of that one also as like a sort of like the charging motif because it's a great motif for, people riding horseback straight into a battle, It's great for that type of thing. Next one is the Might of Rome, introduced when Maximus reveals his identity, used a few times, very sophisticated, very intense, very menacing, and operatic, I think. And that's also used during the ending scene when he goes up into the arena to fight Commodus. Then we have the Wheat/Antiquity theme. And the reason why I call it the Antiquity theme as well is because it has this, you can almost just feel the history of Rome in it. You know what I mean? It has that very... It's very subtle, but it's perfect for that type of thing. Then we have the Earth/Love theme, and Lisa apparently called it the Earth theme, but it sort of bloomed into the Love theme. It goes like this. And then we have the Old Times theme, which is much more subtle theme, but it reminds me a lot of sort of like the innocence of childhood, where there wasn't violence and there wasn't battles or anything like that. And it's used a lot between Connie Nielsen's character and Russell Crowe's character. You can see it's just very relaxed, very innocent. Then we have the Strength and Honor theme, which is super, super simple. It's just sort of like a harmonic motif. It just goes like, G minor. And that theme was used a whole lot with Maximus to show his sort of human side throughout the movie as he's ascending through the ranks. And even though he's in all these battles, it's really, really great because it shows his actual humanity and why he's doing what he's doing, which is just to push on and to avenge his family and the emperor. The final one is Commodus's Wrath. And, this one is built off of all of these sort of stepwise motions. All that type of stuff, and it gets really, really big. But when you first hear it in Reel 8, it is, the interesting thing about it is it's not like a villain theme, like it's not like that. It's much more of a psychological theme. It's going into his mind and looking at his past of being violently ambitious and constantly trying to gain power. And, his pain and violence within him, it shows that in a very, very vivid, clear way. This is a perfect example of music doing something that visuals just cannot do, which is literally going inside the perception of the person and showing every single aspect of the way that they're acting and why they're acting the way that they're acting, and really putting the viewer inside of the mind of that specific character. And that's something that music has the capability of doing, I think. And it's used in a perfect way in relation to Commodus. So there's all of the sort of main themes in the movie. This is like definitely my favorite Hans Zimmer score because of just all of the amazing thematic material. And it's developed so perfectly throughout the movie. And when they come in, sometimes they're subtle, sometimes they're powerful, sometimes they're mysterious. He's great with using themes in so many different ways. And I think that the score has so much power, but also so much emotion, and the contrast between these two aspects is what makes it my favorite Hans Zimmer score to date. So our suite opens with the history theme, or the sort of antiquity theme. This is pretty much over the text that describes sort of the history of Rome leading up to the point where the film opens, which is why I think it's sort of like the history theme. And pretty much that's just sitting on top of some synths and some tremolo strings. You can see the two different tremolo strings that we have are pretty much a tremolo harp, which is turned into a pad. And then we also have this instrument called the oud, which is a lot more drier, so you have two different. And then in terms of the synths, we have sort of like a warmer synth sound, and then a much more saturated synth sound, which together sound like this. So you can see when we bring in our string phrase around bar 6, we sort of open up the synths a bit. We introduce some more elements, including a sort of pad piano, as well as a really, really low synth sound, which is sort of like a replication of the CS80 sound inside of Omnisphere. And then we have a little bit of sort of wind sound effects too, just to really add some warmness to the string section and wrap everything together. And all of that sounds like this. And then we still have our tremolo strings down below. And in terms of the low sort of orchestral string section, we have some tremolos combined with really sort of low. It creates a certain movement to the lower strings. Instead of just having sort of like static low strings, you introduce a little bit of movement, which just makes it a bit more interesting. Now, one thing that I've found to really achieve Hans' very detailed, warm string sound in terms of the melody here is I've combined sort of normal orchestral strings with a solo string patch. And we have sort of like a warmer string sound, but then a more saturated string sound, as well as the solo string. And you can see it just feels a little bit different than if you were to just have, for example, cinematic studio strings. It's just a little bit warmer and has a certain detail to it. But then that's really all that we have going on here. And then we introduce some basses going into the battle, but everything else sort of withdraws at this point. and it doesn't come back in until bar 16 when the French horn melody comes in. So let's begin to talk about the battle cue. So harmonically speaking, we start out in A with the third of the bass, D minor, because it's satisfying. And then we have C major, and then F major with the fifth in the bass, C major, and then we use this D to modulate to this G minor chord. So, we aren't modulating to the key of G minor, but we are using this D, turning this G minor into a G major, which acts as a really great transition. And then we do something that Hans does quite a bit. It's this sort of sequence where he will start out in minor chord, and then it begins to ascend. And really what he's doing is he's taking D minor, and then we have the 2 in the bass, then we have D minor with the third in the bass, and then we're in the root G minor chord. Root G minor chord pretty much with the second inversion up high. And then he goes down to A minor, G minor, F major. Now we're in a new key here, going back to D minor, minor second suspension, major second, or major fourth suspension, and then and this is something he does quite a bit, is where he will resolve to the minor instead of resolving to like the major. So here's what that sounds like. Here's to the major, to the minor. So let's take a look at what we have going on in terms of orchestration. And so you can see we have the melody in the French horns, and then we have a counter melody in the trumpets coming in right over here. So let's just listen to it on its own. Watch out for the trumpet. So right here in bar 27, we have this thing called contrary motion, which is where two different voices are going in different directions. And here's what it sounds like on its own. In terms of low brass, what I figured out recently, by talking with Conrad Pope, is that if you really want to get that Hans Zimmer sound, you put bass trombones in the lowest register. Hans is all about like using the bass trombones as sort of like a very intense, type thing blended with the tubas, just to add a little bit of, because tubas are much more rounder than bass trombones, but trombones have a much more gritty, feeling to them. So what we're doing here is we're doubling tubas with bass trombones, and then we have normal trombones up a register, doing some of the harmonic content. So that's really what we have going on in the brass between bars 9 and 65. So let's take a look at what we have going on in the percussion. The percussion is overall pretty simple. We just have some bass drum hits, some bombos, which are much more rounder sounds, paper drums, bit snappier than the bombos, but a similar timbre. Tombecks are much rounder even than the bombos, but they work really well, doubled with the snappiness of the taikas. They have djembes, which are, you could see, are just moving a little bit more, and here. Which just add a little bit of sort of high-end sonic interest to the rest of the percussion. And then all the way at the bottom here, you can see we have some taikas, really just rounding everything together, and all that together sounds like this. So there's our percussion section. And another thing that Hans does quite a bit that I think works really well is putting sort of booms on very important chord changes. He did this in Time, in Inception. He did this in The Last Samurai quite a bit when we did that. And he does that here as well. And it's not like he puts low booms on every single chord change or something like that, but if it's a big section, like the battle or something like that, if there's big chord changes, he does sort of impact that with some type of low sonic boom. Sometimes you don't even hear it, but it has a certain effect on the mix. So let's take a look at these strings. So we have some long strings that are just sort of doubling under the brass, the basses. High strings. Doubling with the trumpets, by the way. And then over here we have this interesting exchange where it goes from the high strings to the high string harmonics, because it gets so high that I figured the harmonics deals with it way better. So here's that sort of exchange right here. And contextually, you can't even hear the exchange. Apart from that, we just have some choirs, men and women's choirs. You can see the men's choirs is really just duplicating the French horn melody, but just adding a little bit of harmony in it as well. And as you can see, it's generally SATB. You can see there's like 2 voices with the men's choir and then 2 to 3 voices sometimes in the women's choir. But I generally try to keep it as SATB as possible just to make it a little bit more realistic. You can see here we have like a Debussy type deal. And then here we have 3 different voices. But generally speaking, I like to keep choirs SATB. So in terms of guitars, this is what it sounds like on their own. And then over here in bar 67, I bring in some guitars that I recorded myself, right here. And I've just gone in and I've sort of separated them by like a millisecond, and I've panned them hard right and hard left, which creates a really, really nice sort of 3D vibe. And I've just doubled it with the sampled guitar just to get a little bit more of the... It's a little bit of like a blending thing. It's a little bit warmer and rawer than the real recorded guitar, but the real recorded guitar has definitely a more realistic sound than the sampled guitar. In terms of the strings, we have this string run here, which is pretty much a chromatic scale, constantly leading back to D. And then we have this low string. And this becomes a strong part of the battle sequence as a whole. It becomes sort of like a small motif, and it repeats in the low brass and the low strings, and it goes from being like a strings short to being a strings long, and that becomes a strong bass fragment in the battle sequence. And then we have this sort of collegno here. And that is sort of like the transitional tool from bar 67 or 66 to 67. So you could see the strings come in here and they're already duplicating what the strings short were doing in terms of the notes. And that's just a good example of how you can take one idea and just sort of develop it in a way using different instruments or using different ranges of that instrument, or using different articulations with that instrument. So the percussion in this section is made up of this drum bed, which is the bombos, and then some taikos. We have like a rounder taiko, then a bit more of a snappy taiko. And then up to the brass, you could see we have bass trombones doubling low strings, and then here again doubling that specific melody. And then we have these trumpet shorts, which are used just to sort of sit below the mix and add a little bit of sonic interest. A little bit of movement as well, since these, this little melody here is quite slow. This adds just a little bit of movement to it. So going into this little tiny transitional section to the third section here in bar 107, we have the action motif come in. And then you can see we have some low strings that come in and start playing sort of like the chaos motif. And then we have the high strings pretty much replicating what the trumpets are doing. And all together it sounds like this. Now going into 107 through 121. And again, the strings are just taking over the exact same bass phrase that we had going on right here. But modulated. So you'll notice that in the battle sequence, it's constantly modulating from key to key. Like it reminds me a lot of like a John Williams action cue. I mean, it goes from one key to one key to one key to one key, and then you'll end up in the key that you started, but then it'll go to another key. And so, the battle sequence is constantly going between different keys. In this specific section, there's not a whole lot of brass going on, just low brass again, doubling the melody that we had in the low strings. And then for the percussion, we have some brushes, which sound like, where are you? Here they are. Sound like this. And all of it together. You can see I've taken this gong drum here and I've just taken the sort of like the rim sound. We have some 16th notes, just adding a little bit of movement to the percussion. And without it, it doesn't sound necessarily bad, but it doesn't sound full. So here's all the percussion together. Alright, so going into this next section in terms of percussion, the main element we bring in is actually from Cineperk Epic. This should say Cineperk Epic. And it sounds like this. And it's a super, super cool patch, which is pretty much the big ensemble patch, but it has like cymbals and huge hits, and you can hear there's anvils in there, and it's a great, great patch if you really want to like fill in a huge sort of percussion sound. So here's what that sounds like all together. And let's take a look at the brass. So here we're using just brass shorts mainly. So you can see we have French horns here, the melody, and then we have bass, then we have harmony, then just a little bit for movement. You can see this is a much more muffled sound. This is actually the monster brass from Cinebrass, but combined with the rest of the brass. Sort of creates like a muted brass sound. It works really, really well contextually. And then that's also being doubled in the high strings here. And all of what we had going on in the brass is also being doubled in the strings just for extra impact. So in section 4, we introduced the harmonic theme, which is essentially just taking a first inversion chord and moving it up and down. And so that's really what it's doing there. We just have it in the brass. So one really, really cool thing I think that Hans did in section 4 is parallel voice leading, which is where all of the voices are moving in the exact same direction. And, you know, music theorists would tell you, no, that's not proper voice leading, but it creates this really, really cool, creepy sound. And here's what that sounds like. And then, of course, above that are the trumpets. So in terms of the harmony in this next section, we have G minor. We have that minor sixth in there. F major. And then that's really like an E flat major. And certain things like what he just did there, which is where he does this. Certain things like that can go unseen, but what he's doing is he's literally taking suspension, major, suspension, minor. So it's a really, really cool sequence. And then we have a little bit of brass along just filling in the harmony beneath everything. And then the percussion is probably the biggest that it's been in the battle cue so far. You can see we have, you know, that big Cineperk ensemble. We have, you know, tons of medals. We have low booms. We have the gong drum again doing the 16th notes. We have taikos, and then the Hans Zimmer percussion elements that we were using previously. And then going into the strings, we just have, again, some strings along, just filling in the harmony, really combining with the brass longs, just to sort of sit beneath the brass short. So in terms of harmony, we start out in C major. So we have C major, G7, C, G7, G sus4, A minor, E minor with the third in the bass. We saw tons of that in The Last Samurai. And that's where he pretty much turns into a F major second inversion up in the top range. And then he has a C major with the third in the bass. And then there's and really what that is it's just a Lydian where you have the natural fourth. And then back. E minor with third of the bass again, and then back to A. So we have that in the strings, and then just a little bit of sort of embellishment in the synths as well. Alrighty, so now we are into The Emperor is Dead, which is where the wheat theme is presented. And this is a scene from the beginning of the film where Commodus kills Marcus Aurelius, and this is the music that plays after. And it has the theme being played on a hammered dulcimer. And I also brought in just a snippet of the solo vocals just to show you how it sort of sounded at the beginning of the film as well. So this is sort of a combination of those two different scenes. So the melody is being played in the hammered dulcimer, and the melody sounds like this on its own. But in this case, it's sort of like skipping. And then we have some synths layered beneath that. So we have the granular piano again, the sort of saturated synth sound, and then the really round synth sound. As well as just sort of like a manipulated solo vocal. So that's pretty much it for this cue. I just really wanted to bring it into the suite because I think it's a really, really important theme for the movie, especially in relation to Maximus's character. At the beginning of the film, when Maximus comes back to his villa and finds his family has been murdered, this is actually the first thing that you hear is this melody being played, and it's a piece called Sorrow, and she sings this specific melody, so it's a very, very strong melody in relation to the story. So that's why I wanted to bring it into the suite. So now we have the Might of Rome, which is pretty much the piece of music that we hear when we first see Rome in the movie. And it has a very sophisticated, Germanic, sort of like operatic sound to it. And here is that piece. Alright, so you can see we start out with a string trill, and we're in the key of D major in this piece. And here is the trill, and then we bring in the main melody. High strings. And then we have this bass, or this cello arpeggio. Just to create a little bit of movement. When we come in here, we bring in this high string sort of build. Which sort of builds up to that high D, and contextually it sounds like this. So you can see there's also some harmony right here, and the high strings. And the brass is much simpler. There isn't much movement in the brass. It's just sort of enforcing the harmony that we have going on. So here's the brass on its own. So you can see what we did is we started out with a much softer orchestral classic brass, and then we bring in some more heavier brass. So you can see this is like horns A9 and some bass trombones just to have it a little bit more impactful. Then we have the tubas and trombone. And then for the percussion, we just have some timpani rolls and some low sort of booms. And what I did is I just sort of doubled the timpani hit with the bass drum hit because it has a much sort of warmer, rounder sound. Those together. So Am I Not Merciful has some awesome harmonic things going on, and this is actually towards the ending of the piece when they rise up into the arena. So we start out with B minor. Then we have F sharp sus4 with the C sharp in the bass. A with G in the bass creates this dominant inversion. D minor, and then really what we're doing here is we're just moving the inversion of D minor up. So we have like, and then we finally have this diminished right there, and then back to A. And this reminds me a whole lot of like Dark Knight. And so that's really all that we have going on harmonically speaking. But you know, all this type of stuff, super interesting. So what I've done here for the choirs is I've taken a more aggressive choir. This one's saying O, and this one I believe is saying like ooh, like 2 O's. Yeah. And so both of them together. And then in these strings, we have just our normal strings being doubled by these string trems and the basses, which again just creates a movement of the strings, all being doubled by a much more sort of aggressive bass just to reinforce the low end. Then we also, as usual, have the sub bass in the low end, which is, you know, if you play it on its own, really hard to pick up at all. But when you layer it underneath everything, you can definitely tell the difference between when it's there and when it's not there. So yeah, that's what we have going on during this section here. And then we go to the brass. So when we first come in, the brass is very minimal, but as we sort of progress through the piece, you can see the dynamics definitely increase, and we bring in our more aggressive sort of French horn and trombone patch here. Then we have the melody and the French horn. You can see all of these chord changes are again being impacted by the timpani hits. And then in the strings we just bring in a reinforcement to the French horns. And then apart from that, during this section right here on bar 227, we just have a couple different elements that we bring in. We have a strings sort of portato, which is pretty much like a very aggressive, like marcato, very sort of bitey, intense attack. combined with Oceania from Performance Samples, which is a great Marcato-based choir library. It's a very aggressive. So now we're on to the final piece of music in the suite, and this is, the track right before Now We Are Free on the soundtrack album. And it's a very, very impactful, very emotional piece of music. And so let's just listen to it, and then we'll go back and take a look at what's going on. But here is Honor Him. So when we first come into the piece, it's a sort of very ambient environment, and this is what the synths sort of sound like on their own. And then when we add the harposphere, and that harposphere evolves into the actual, harp tremolo, which creates a very, very sort of natural sound when combined with the strings and the sort of synth harp. So one thing that I really, really like about Hans' style is he will take sounds that are naturally very soft and actually make them a strong part of the mix. And so in this case, he makes the harp, and I also included this instrument called the kora, which is sort of blends with the harp, gives it a much brighter sound. But he sort of puts that at the forefront, sort of layering with the main melody. And if you listen to it in context... He did this in Interstellar too with the cornfield chase, if you remember that cue. But so that's sort of what we have going on here, and I've just taken it and I've panned it hard right, hard left, and done the moved them by 1 millimeter just to give it a little bit more wideness. And then we have again the kora, just sort of doubling that. So just taken the patch, duplicated it, panned it hard right, hard left, and I've just moved them by 1 millimeter, and it gives it that nice wide sound. The choirs are fairly inaudible in terms of the whole entire mix, but you can definitely hear its effect. That's the thing about Hans's mixes, is that there's so many different sonic elements contributing to the overall sound that you're hearing that nothing is ever as it seems on the surface. So you always have to go in and try to find what exactly he's putting underneath the surface to get the texture that he's getting. And especially, we saw that with Interstellar. Interstellar was just a massive, that was very difficult to figure out what he was doing, because there's so many elements, whether it's, organ sounds or manipulated sounds that are just sort of blending in with other elements, or, evolutions from synths into natural instruments, or from organ stops to regular orchestral woodwinds. There's a whole lot of stuff going on. But this is just a good example of how one small element that when you listen to the mix doesn't really even sound very evident, can really contribute to the overall sound. So that's what we have going on there. And then for the strings, I'm doubling the consort strings with the flautando strings just to add a bit more of a upfront, delicate sound. So here is the flautando on its own. Consort on its own. You can see the flautando just naturally warms up the concertina. So over here in bar 252, we have something similar to what we did in the Might of Rome, which is really just like a string, climb. So then, of course, we just have the main melody and the French horns, and then the brass is really just providing accompaniment to that, harmonically speaking, and then really warming up what we have going on in the strings. So here is just the brass on its own. But other than that, that is all that we have going on inside of Honor Him. So there is the breakdown of the suite. Now, in the next section, we're going to be heading into just some of the technical aspects regarding the sample library and what I'm doing in terms of mixing and everything like that. So I'll see you in the next part. So let's take a quick look at some of the technical aspects behind the suite. So first thing is samples. So for woodwinds, there's literally no woodwinds other than a flute at the beginning of the suite, which I use for the wheat theme. And that is literally just a flute from Berlin Woodwinds that I ran through Black Hole Reverb. And you can hear the tail is just super, super long. It's a great, great reverb if you're looking for a reverb as more of an effect versus trying to put something in a realistic sounding acoustic environment. So that's what I'm using for the Berlin, for the woodwinds, Berlin Woodwinds. So in terms of brass, I have a few different folders. The first one is Berlin Brass, and that's great for your more traditional brass. It has a very classical sound and a very realistic tone. But it doesn't necessarily get very mean, which is why I use Metropolis Arc 1. So I'm using the bass trombones patch and the horns A9 sustain for a few different sections, just to give actually reinforcement to a lot of the rest of the brass, or to provide a more aggressive tone, which works much, much better with like sort of aggressive driving strings or something, because it sticks out more than Berlin Brass for sure. So in terms of brass shorts, we're using the Native Instruments Symphony Series brass, and it's just incredible for that super, super aggressive. Here's what it sounds like. Super, super bitey and intense. And then we have, in terms of the additional brass, Metropolis Arc 1. We have a little bit of Symphony Series brass for the longs, and it has a, I would say it has a much more warmer tone than Berlin Brass, which is much, I think, works really, really well when blending with big string ensembles, but not necessarily that well if you're looking for a more aggressive brass sound, which is why we're using, Metropolis Arc 1 during this section. But for the section where we have the harmonic chord planning motif, we're using the Symphony Series brass. Additionally, we have Albion 3 for the very wide brass. Here's what it sounds like on its own. You can see it just has that huge, huge, massive. Especially great for the low brass. I use it almost entirely to really reinforce like the bottom end of the brass section, and not necessarily like low brasses and bass trombones, because these are much more, I would say, spiky, much more aggressive, while this type of low brass is much more rich and full, which is very, very helpful for a mix, especially, blending with the contrabasses and really providing a very warm low end. So in terms of percussion, we're using a few different things. The first one is Hans Zimmer percussion. Has a very sort of wide, round sound to it. In addition, we have a little bit of Metropolis Arc 3, and it has a much more raw, sort of primal sound. Much more of like an Isle of Dogs type sound. Recent Despot score, really, really good. And then we have 8D Taiko Ensemble for the snap. A little bit of Cineperk Epic. Just for a little sort of like high-end sonic interest in the percussion section. And that's really all that we have, other than, we have the Hans Zimmer percussion low booms. And then a little bit of Metropolis Arc 2 low booms as well. So for the strings, I'm using Spitfire Chamber Strings Consort Ensemble as the main sort of go-to string patch. Has a great silky sound. We have a little bit of Mural for the basses, and I'm also using a bit of Spitfire Chamber Strings Flautando, sometimes blending with Concertino, which just gives it a little bit more of a raw sound, a little bit more detail. We're also using a bit of Metropolis Arc 2 high sustains, as well as some Cinematic Studio strings. Which I'm usually blending. Many times what I actually do is I will blend the solo cello with Spitfire chamber strings and Cinematic Studio strings. And with the Spitfire chamber strings, you get the really raw sound. Chamber strings, you get the very sort of wide cinematic sound. And then with the solo cello, you get the detailed sound. And all that together sounds like this. And I just use sort of EQ to compensate, but the timbre of those combined, sounds very, very sort of real and very sort of smooth. So that's what I'm using for that. And then apart from that, let's take a look at what we have going on for the tremolos. So I have Berlin Orchestra Inspire. That's a much more sort of detailed sound. The mural trems have a bit more of a silky sound to it. Whereas the Berlin Orchestra Inspire and then we're using Albion 2 for the trills. Sounds like this. In terms of string shorts, we have a few different things. This is the Cinematic Studio Strings 2. This is the runs patch, and I've just sort of taken it an octave down, which just creates a bit more of a wide sound. In terms of Metropolis Arc 2, if you look at the user interface, it says Pia, Pia, Pianissimo. I mean, it's super, super quiet. But if you play it, it has such a really, really cool raw. It has that sort of Ben Wolfish tone, like the very... which sounds really, really cool. Then we have Metropolis Arc 3 for the low and high staccato. Much more, I would say it's actually much more wider than Metropolis Arc 1 shorts, but at the same time, it's a bit less dynamic and a bit less sort of colorful than Metropolis Arc 1. I'll play them both so you can hear it. And then here's Metropolis Arc 1. You can see it has a bit more of a... it has a much more... versus... it's not as sort of big as Metropolis Arc 1, but it's great for that really, really wide sound. And then I'm using Mural for sort of like the much more casual shorts. So for this specific Colegno, what I ended up just doing is throwing on some reverb and then just programming the delay myself. Contextually, it sounds like this. So that's what we have going on there. So in terms of choir, I'm using a couple different things. We have Lacrimosa, as well as a bit of Dominus. Combined sounds like this. Tiny bit of Oceania. And that's really what we're using for the choir. Then we have a solo voice, and we're using a bit of Etheria. So in terms of harp, we have Berlin Orchestra Inspire, which is a much more contextual harp. And then Angelic, which is a much more sort of Desplatty type harp. And then the core is an instrument from Asia, I think. It definitely probably wasn't what Hans used in the score, but if you layer it on top of the harp, I wanted something to excite the harp, which ended up just sounding like this on its own. And I tried EQ, but adding this did exactly what I wanted. And then in terms of synths, mainly just Omnisphere, and then the sub bass from Albion 3, Iceni. And then we have a little bit of the Harposphere. which is really just from the Spitfire harp library, and it's just sort of a manipulated approach to a harp natural sample. And then we have a little bit of real recorded guitar, and I was like, I really want to get a more realistic sound from this guitar because, you know, the sampled guitar wasn't sounding too good. So I was like, all right, I'll keep that in there, but I'm just going to layer it. And trust me, I am no good guitarist. I'll be the first person to admit that. I am not very good at all, but, you know, I was able to figure out how to play that melody, and I just recorded it, and it ends up, you know, making it a little bit more realistic. And that is all that we're doing in terms of samples in this suite. And really, I'm not using too many effects. I, you know, recently took a masterclass from TJ Lindgren, who's worked on Justice League, a lot of Danny Elfman films, and he doesn't use like literally any reverb or EQ. Now, I definitely love my EQ, but at the same time, you know, I don't find the need for too much reverb. I use some black hole every now and then as an effects reverb, and I do bus some of my channels to a reverb just to give it a little bit more life and contextual sort of feeling. But other than that, you know, it's a pretty simple mix. And then here you can see we have the stereo out where we just have a limiter and a clariphonic. And this is really just a saturator. Just helps sort of warm up the mix a bit. And you can see I'm just using the clarity setting. So apart from that, you can see we just have our tempo map up here. We have our time signatures. I put markers when I'm actually doing the suites because it helps me stay organized. And that's really all that we have going on. I also have effects channels for all the different instrument groups, so I could send it there. And then I also have group tracks, so if I need to do sort of big universal automation things. And if I just show all used automation, let's see. You can see I'm using quite a bit of automation. I mainly use automation for my sort of expression. So that is really it in terms of the technical aspects behind the suite. So thanks so much for watching. Hope that you guys enjoyed today's episode. I think that what Hans and Lisa did combined with what Ridley did, it's just an amazing movie. And every time I watch it, it's like I'm watching it for the first time. It's just so well done. And, you know, I had a great time diving into it. And I hope that you guys did as well. But if you guys are interested, there's the project file and the MIDI file and the stems, as well as a high-res version of the suite down below. And if you guys have any comments, questions, recommendations, do put that down below in the comments, and I will definitely get back to you on that. But I will for sure see you in the next video. Thanks so much for watching, and see ya.